Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 2 of our story. If you haven't heard part 1, click on the description because you don't want to miss out on the entire story. So let's continue with tonight's story. 12 years later, Bobby was feeling nervous about seeing his brother Chris for the first time in 12 years. Where had the time got to? It seemed to have slipped through his fingers like butter. All these years later, he was still haunted by the memories of his brother's ex-girlfriend, Judy Bengali, and what had become of her. For a long time, her missing persons posters were hung around the small town, on every tree and every lamp-post, inviting people not to forget the 18-year-old teenager. But soon the fast-moving hands of time eroded her memory, and blustering winds blew the scattered remnants of those posters away, so that the faint, ambiguous memory of Judy Bengali had become like a fading blur on people's minds. But for Bobby, her poignant, indelible memory was as raw and as real as if it had happened only yesterday. By all accounts, there were no eyewitness reports of Judy being seen on that night, walking alone on that sequestered, lonely road that at night in those days welcomed very little traffic, if at all. As Bobby got older, he persuaded himself that his brother had nothing to do with Judy's disappearance. Yes, he was negligent for not taking Judy Bengali back home safely to her parents' house in the throes of an argument. It would have been the chivalrous, decent thing for him to do. And Chris had failed to behave like a gentleman that night. He couldn't bear to think that Chris might have harmed the young lady and buried her remains somewhere so ambiguously obscure that her bones would never ever be recovered. Looking back, he knew his brother had a temper on him, but was he capable of getting so irate that he'd lashed out so hard that night and inadvertently killed Judy? He remembered a time when he thought his brother was going to break his skull apart. His brother had been appalled that Bobby would ever believe he was capable of really hurting him. As Bobby waited in the arrivals hall very patiently with his mother at his side to meet his estranged brother Chris, he barely recognized the young man, walking boldly across the sprawling white tiles and opening glass doors of the arrivals hall, with a huge grin on his face. And standing loyally by his side was an attractive young lady with bouncy brown hair, olive skin, and brown, cheerful eyes. And the biggest shock of all was that the woman was heavily pregnant. Chris ebulliently rushed forward to greet them, leaving the mysterious woman at the trolley, smiling at them shyly. Mrs. Hilton flung her arms around her beloved son and hugged him so tightly to her chest. It was like she didn't want to ever let him go again. Chris turned around to hug Bobby. His expression was so warm, Bobby was literally taken aback. "It's good to see you, Squirt. I've missed you a whole lot. I barely recognize you anymore. You filled out so much." His approving eyes swept over his brother. "Well, I've been lifting weights," said Bobby modestly. "I've always been way too skinny. You know I have. I decided I needed to fill out a little. I knocked back a few liters of milk every week to fill up, but the scales never shifted, so I turned to lifting weights instead and doing some boxing, and then I saw some substantial changes." "Well, you look great, Squirt," said Chris. "We've got lots of catching up to do. There's so much to tell you all." "You talk about Bobby changing, Chris, but the same can be applied to you, my darling. I barely recognized you when you walked through the arrivals hall. I thought, who is that strange man waving at me? I got the shock of my life when I realized it was actually you. You've grown up so much. I'm beginning to feel suddenly quite old," said Mrs. Hilton, chuckling, as she stood back to admire her older son, as if observing a great work of art. "Chris, you were always a looker, weren't you? But you've grown into quite a handsome, debonair young man. You look startlingly like my father, and he broke many a woman's heart, let me tell you." It was true. If Chris Hilton had been a heartthrob at school, he'd only grown better looking in the last 12 years, if that were at all possible. It seemed the Greek sunshine and all that olive oil had done wonders for his appearance. Chris's skin was a nut brown colour with a golden hue. It made his silvery green eyes stand out all the more. "Oh, Mum, I want to introduce you both to Natalia," said Chris, taking Natalia's hand and bringing her towards his mother. "Mum, meet my fiancé. We have a baby on the way. You're going to be a grandmother." Mrs. Hilton's face broke out into a huge smile. "Oh, dear me! I don't know what to say. This day is getting better by the minute." She rushed towards the rather bashful-looking young lady, throwing her arms around Natalia. "Hello, Natalia! Oh, my word, it is so good to meet you!" she cried out. "Welcome to the family." She looked at Chris, and her eyes twinkled. "Why did you not tell me I'm going to be a grandmother? And why did you not breathe a word about your engagement? You are dreadfully naughty. You've got a lot of explaining to do." "There's plenty of time for that, Mum. Besides, I wanted it to be a surprise for you and Dad, to find out you were going to be grandparents. I also wanted you to meet Natalia for yourself firsthand. Talking about her is not the same, you know." "A surprise, Chris! Honestly, you are the end. I feel like a parrot that's been knocked off its perch in its gilded cage. But I am so thrilled with your news. I can hardly believe I'm going to be a grandmother. Your father is going to be delighted. I feel older every second. Where did the years get to? Only the other day I was pushing you in a push-pram along the beach and watching you and your brother building sand castles and collecting shells. And now I'm about to be a grandmother." "Oh, Mum," said Chris, kissing her tenderly on the cheeks. "You're so dreadfully sentimental." Before long the Hilton family were gathered together happily around the table. The living room had been set to entertain royalty, as Mrs. Hilton had gone to so much trouble, on Chris's account, to make everything in their home perfect for the return of the prodigal son. The table was lavishly bedecked with her finest china and her best silver. There was a huge floral bouquet in the centre of the table, and floating balloons with the words, "Welcome home, Chris." Bobby watched as his mother strutted around like a mother hen, crooning over her little chickens. Bobby could not keep his eyes off his brother. He had matured significantly, and his face was radiant with happiness. Bobby's parents were thrilled to see their son again, and his father looked as if he was bursting with pride to have his older son back at home. Bobby could see his brother was clearly in love with Natalia, and over delicious plates of pad thai and sticky spare ribs, the family talked happily while the hours melted away like batter on a hot muffin. Every eye was inquisitively focused on Chris, as he talked garrulously about his wonderful life in Greece, growing olive trees and picking the highest quality olives that were then transformed into the finest olive oil that was exported to all parts of the globe. He told his parents how he'd met Natalia. "She came over to the farm one day. She was working for her father's restaurant and was looking for specialty olive oil to use in their cooking and to sell to their customers in the delicatessens section of the restaurant. I agreed to meet up with her and give her a sample of our oils. I mean, we've got many varieties. When she came to our door and said, 'I'm looking for Chris,' my heart, well, it did a double leap, let me tell you. The moment I set eyes on Natalia, I knew she was the one," said Chris proudly. "I took her around the olive groves, and then we tasted all the olive oil together. She told me she liked my accent and asked me where I was from. We sat there watching the sunset over the groves of olives. I invited her to join the family for dinner. I kept asking her around to try and sample this olive oil and that. And then, well, the rest is history. I proposed to Natalia under a tree in the grove, where a beautiful table had been set and a delicious spread laid out." "It was so romantic," said Natalia, chuckling, lifting up her finger to show everyone her diamond engagement ring. They then proceeded to talk about Natalia's pregnancy. "At first I thought that I'd been struck, with a bad food poisoning," she said. I was violently sick. Then we discovered we were pregnant, she said with a huge beam across her face. There was such a celebration back at the family restaurant. If my family had my way, we'd have, hundreds of kids. Believe me, young lady, if you want my advice, you don't want to have more than 2 children. Look at this grey hair of mine. Can you see it? That's what my children did to me. Sorry, kids, but it's true. Overnight it was. No, said Mr. Hilton, shaking his head fiercely. 15, Natalia. That's far too many. Natalia began to laugh. In Greece, we like to have, big family, said Natalia, grinning. But you're right, Mr. Hilton. 15, no, it's too many. I told my father, no way. But I think 4 would be nice. We will compromise. Sounds like a very good idea, Natalia. Do you know what sex my grandbaby is? Asked Mr. Hilton excitedly. We don't know the sex, said Natalia, meeting Chris's eyes. We want it to be, a surprise. I think it much nicer not to know. But, I have a sneaking suspicion that I'm expecting a boy. The thing has been kicking in my stomach as if it's playing football. Oh dear, said Mrs. Hilton. I must tell you, Natalia, that Chris was like that in my belly. Mind you, Bobby over here, I was convinced he was a girl. I didn't get many kicks from him. Are you nervous about the inquest into the disappearance of Judy Bengali? Asked Bobby, his eyes fixing on his brother. Chris seemed relieved to be broaching the subject, as if the uncomfortable elephant in the room was finally being addressed. After all, this was the reason he had returned to North America, to attend the inquest. Do you know what, Bobby? He said, putting his knife and fork down. I know there are a lot of people out there that think me or Russ have something to do with Judy's vanishing, which was why Dad sent me to live in Greece, to escape all those rumours and the wild speculation. And it was the best decision ever. I really enjoyed working with the Olives. And if I hadn't gone over to Greece, I'd never have met lovely Natalia, he said, reaching out to grab his fiancée's hand. Some things are just meant to be. Natalia's eyes met Chris's, and there were silent words of love spoken between the two of them, and Bobby found himself hoping that one day he'd meet someone who loved him as much as Natalia obviously loved his brother. Do you know what, Bobby? He said, putting his knife and fork down stoically. I know there are a lot of people out there that think me or Russ have something to do with Judy's vanishing, which was why Dad sent me to live in Greece, to escape the nasty rumours, the wild speculation floating all around town. It certainly was the best decision ever. I thoroughly enjoyed working with the Olives, and with Dad's brother, who's an amazing man. If I hadn't got over there, I'd never have met Natalia, he said, reaching out to grab his fiancée's hands very fondly. Some things are just meant to be, aren't they? Natalia's eyes met Chris's, and there were silent words of love spoken between the two of them, and Bobby found himself hoping that one day he'd meet someone who loved him as much as Natalia obviously loved his brother. I have to say, Mr. and Mrs. Hilton, I'm so lucky to have met your wonderful son, Chris. I know he would never harm a fly. He's got the kindest heart. Always rues the day he never took Judy home. It's very unlike him not to do that. Well, you always get the nasty gossips, don't you? Said Mrs. Hilton. They believe the very worst in people. I know Mrs. Bengali, for example, hasn't spoken to me for years, ever since the dreadful ordeal when Judy vanished. I suppose I can't blame her, really. The family's been glaring at me for years in the church. They've also been giving Russ's family ominous looks. They're convinced one of our family's kids is responsible for Judy's disappearance. But I know that Chris would never have harmed a hair on her head. He really loved Judy a lot, you know. Things can happen. It's part of life. It is so desperately tragic that this happened. I so wish one could turn back the hands of time, but one can't. It certainly turned our lives upside down. We've never ever been the same again. For us, it's as if Judy only disappeared yesterday. That's how conspicuously fresh it's still in our minds. We will never forget the girl. Well, the Bengalis are not wrong, Mum, said Chris soberly. I am responsible for what happened to Judy, even if it is indirect. I never should have let that girl walk home that night on her own. What was I thinking? When I went after her in my car, I realized how dreadful I had been to refuse her a lift. And when I travelled down that road and I didn't see her, I knew instinctively that something bad had happened to her. She couldn't have got home that quickly on her own. I went back to look for her again, you know, but she was gone. I do remember coming home at one point and vomiting in the toilet, and going to bed that night thinking, please God, may she have got home safely. May someone have given her a lift. But deep down in my gut, I had my doubts that she'd got home at all. Something felt off. When I got out of my car that night and looked around for Judy, calling out her name, something in my gut felt really off. Really, said Mrs. Hilton. You do surprise me. You never told me this before. Because, Mum, it was just a feeling. An intuitive nudging or impression, if you like, that told me something wasn't right. The police don't want to hear about feelings. They want facts. But on that night, something was off. I could feel it in my bones. I genuinely felt afraid. Oh dear, said Mrs. Hilton. The more I hear about the Bengali case, the worse it becomes. I will be so glad when this inquest is finally behind us, and we can move on with our lives. It's certainly been long enough. Natalia reached out to squeeze her fiancé's hand. I'm glad, I agree with you, Miss Hilton. I am glad the inquest is finally here. I know on the outside your son looks great, but believe me, the disappearance of Judy has been eating him up for years. He still has nightmares, over what happened to her. Sometimes he wakes up in a cold sweat. The problem was, I was bloody jealous, very insecure at the time, said Chris, raising a brow. I felt as if that girl had punched me in the guts. The thought of her cheating on me with Russ Edwards of all people, well, it did my head in, and I was so angry that night. I don't remember being more angry than that. I let her walk home on her own because I was furious, completely enraged with her. When I went after her twice in one night, she'd vanished off the face of the earth. I don't blame people for doubting me. To be honest, in their shoes, I'd probably feel the same. But I'm not kidding when I say something was wrong that night. And whatever happened to Judy, it was swift, I'm sure of it. Bobby had been surprised and somewhat confounded to hear his brother Chris nonchalantly talking about being insecure. He thought his self-assured, confident brother had it all. But maybe his brother's cockiness all those years ago was just a bravado. As Bobby listened to his brother's earnestness, he began to doubt that Chris had anything to do with Judy's disappearance. He was now more certain than ever. He seemed so sincere. If he wasn't responsible for her vanishing, then who was? Bobby tried to think about Russ Edwards. Could he have been the one who had something to hide? The young man had made no secret of his infatuation towards Judy Bengali. Could he have by chance run into her on the road, offered to give her a lift home, and when she told him yet again she wasn't interested in him, had he taken her rejection so terribly badly that he had killed her and clandestinely hidden her body? Bobby had heard that Russ had beaten up a local boy so badly, after claiming the man had vandalized his car, and deliberately scratched the words murderer on his bonnet. The young man had ended up hospitalized. Was it possible that Russ Edwards had harmed Judy Bengali when his temper had got the better of him? Bobby wondered how he would react in the same circumstances if someone dared to scratch out murderer on the bonnet of his car. For years, having people suspiciously doubting your integrity had to eat away at you like a worm in an apple and make you as mad as hell, especially if you were completely innocent. As if Chris was reading his brother's very thoughts, he said, "You know what, Squirt? Even if we never know what actually happened to Judy, at least the inquest will bring things to a close. We can put things behind us. I've been dreading the inquest for years, but the sooner it's over with, the better. Natalia and Mum are right about that. I just don't like that can of worms being opened up all over again," said Bobby's father gingerly, wiping the crumbs away from his mouth with a napkin. "Me and your mother, we nearly moved away from here all those years ago because all the scandal in town was getting the better of us. But thanks to the town sheriff and his persuasions, people believed, Chris, that you had nothing to do with Judy's disappearance. People tend to listen to the sheriff. That man is a wizened old soul. He stuck his neck out for you over the years, you know. We got lots of support from the townsfolk after that, when all the speculations were being whirled around like candy floss about what had happened to Judy. It was tough going for us, and of course for the Edwards family. I also felt very sorry for them. Thankfully, over the years, the rumours and speculation and chatter has died down when other stories tend to grab people's attention. People haven't talked about the Bengali case for years. People these days only have fond memories of you, Chris. They always ask after you, and when you're coming home." "I don't know," said Mrs. Hilton reflectively. "Sometimes at an inquest, when the wound is open again, other witnesses can come forward, you know. Sometimes answers can be found. I do feel so much empathy for the Bengali family. I can't imagine what it's like not knowing what became of their daughter. The not knowing is a killer, you know. I can't imagine how I would feel. If any one of you were to go missing, I'm not sure I'd have pulled through like Mrs. Bengali has. That woman has been like a Trojan horse, given everything considered." "I don't like to say this, Mum," said Chris reflectively, "but I think we can all establish that something bad must have happened to Judy that night. I do not believe for a moment she's in life any more. I know she'd never have committed suicide, nor would she have run away to start a brand new life. I think she met with some foul play, unless she had a fortuitous accident, and if that is the case, her body was never recovered." For a brief moment, there was a lugubrious melancholia around the dinner table, and nobody said a word. Finally, Mrs. Hilton broke the silence. "It's so tragic. She was such a lovely girl, wasn't she? I do remember how sweet she was. I don't know how this could have happened to her. I just wish we could finally have some closure to this case. It's haunted me for so many years. But just so you know, Chris, me and your father have never doubted you for a moment, and as you know, the town sheriff has never doubted your innocence either, not even for a second. That's what he told me." "He said that to you?" asked Chris, looking surprised. "Oh, yes, he did. He was singing your praises. He says it was an unfortunate set of circumstances, the Judy Bengali case, but he'd bet his life on it that you had nothing to do with her disappearance. He said once on a Boy Scout trip with you and a group of boys, one of the scouts nearly fell over the edge of the cliff, and you didn't hesitate to pull the young man back to safety, even though it put you in perilous danger, because it was incredibly slippery. He said you didn't spare any thought for your own safety, but risked life and limb to save the young man. You were a hero that day, and nobody forgot that either. Everybody was in awe of your bravery, because without your intervention, that young man would almost certainly have died. He was holding on to a tree root, but the branch was very flimsy,
and he was running out of strength. Everyone stood back in horror, watching, knowing that even if they called for help, it would be far too late for the young man. But you intervened, at the risk of your own life, and the sheriff said what you did was heroic and nothing short of it. No one else had the courage to do what you did.
Oh, that, said Chris. That was no big deal.
But it was, sweetheart, and the sheriff said it shows what kind of a character you have. I know the sheriff has always believed my account, said Chris, but it is nice he's persuaded the townsfolk of my innocence. He's a good man. He was only speaking the truth, my love, said Mrs. Hilton, lovingly reaching out to squeeze her son's hand. It's all going to be all right at the inquest. You wait and see, she said, giving him an encouraging wink. The inquest. Bobby was amazed to hear about how his own brother had saved a Boy Scout from falling over a cliff. He'd never heard about the story before. His brother had never blown his own trumpet about the event, but clandestinely brushed it under the carpet. But it was something to brag about, for not many people would lightly be willing to lose their footing and go tumbling down the cliff to meet their imminent demise. It cemented Bobby's belief that maybe over all these years he had completely misunderstood his brother. Maybe his brother's belittling of him when he was younger was some kind of an affectionate humiliation, if you can call it that. Not that he saw it like that at the time, of course. Ostensibly his mother had tirelessly told him over the years, "Chris loves the bones of you, Bobby. You've got him all wrong. He just loves teasing you and winding you up because of your reactions. If you didn't react in the way you did, which is always hilarious, he probably wouldn't pick on you so much. You're a sitting duck for his abuse." Bobby had hated living under his brother's shadow. He admitted to himself he had always been jealous of Chris. His brother had been a popular kid at school, great at sports. Teachers had lavishly poured praises on him and his academic prowess. He had been one of those people that was good at everything and offered scholarships left, right and centre as if they were growing under his armpits. And furthermore, his brother had annoyingly drawn girls to him, like fireflies to a bright lamp. Bobby had bashfully never had the same bedazzling effect on girls. He was not exciting enough, that was for sure. Then there was the quintessential fact that he had secretly nurtured a crush towards his brother's girlfriend, Judy Bengali, at the time. He knew it was wrong to hanker after your brother's girlfriend, but he couldn't help himself. He, like Russ Edwards, thought a woman with red hair was like a goddess, but this was a secret he had wisely kept to himself at the time. After Judy's fortuitous disappearance, he'd always doubted his brother, but maybe a small part of him wanted to believe the worst in him as some kind of macabre payback for being the butt of his brother's jokes. For a moment Bobby felt self-disgust and loathing that he could have ever doubted his brother. Yes, Chris had a bad temper on him, that was for sure, but so did lots and lots of other people. But it didn't mean they set out to murder people in the heat of the moment. Most people who thought their girlfriend was cheating on them were entitled to be angry. It was a natural human reaction. Even if Chris's reactions had been disproportionately over the top and rather dramatic. Despite everything, Chris had never been predisposed to violence, and on the occasion when Bobby thought his brother was going to kill him, his brother, on the cusp of his indignance, had withdrawn from their heated altercation. Chris had genuinely been shocked that his brother thought he was going to harm him. "My God, you really thought I was going to hurt you," he had said, looking so disappointed in Bobby, as if he couldn't believe his brother could get him so wrong. Bobby wondered if once, when this was over, the two estranged brothers could finally become friends again. But he did long to know what had become of poor Judy Bengali. He knew if his brother Chris had dated Judy, and then the relationship had ended, he'd have likely long since forgotten his brother's girlfriend. But because of this case hanging over them, like a bad smell, having never been closed, it had continually haunted his life and the lives of his parents, who had never been allowed to forget the young 18-year-old girl. At breakfast on the morning of the inquest, no one ate much, for the mood was sombre and bleak in the Hilton household. You could have touched the tension with a knife. Glasses of orange juice were abandoned in favour of mugs of coffee. Everyone was craving a caffeine hit to get through the day that lay ahead of them. By the looks of things, no one had enjoyed a peaceful night's sleep the night before.
"Isn't anyone going to eat?" Mrs. Hilton had complained. "We shouldn't go to the inquest on empty stomach, should we?" "We can't eat," Mr. Hilton's voice had boomed. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know you meant well." "I think we should be making tracks," he said begrudgingly. "We need to get to the courthouse, and we need to get this day over and done with."
The Hilton family filed into the large minibus together, like steers being led to the slaughter. Mr. Hilton drove to the inquest. His hands remained on the steering wheel, but they were so tight you could see the whites of his knuckles showing obtrusively through his skin. He tried to steady and calm his nerves by focusing intently on the traffic. Mrs. Hilton had dressed in a black dress with a white belt. She believed wearing anything colourful would be dishonourable, and she didn't want to draw attention to herself. She could imagine the headlines in the local paper. "Mother of son who was one of the suspects in the Judy Bengali case causes a stir when she arrives at the inquest in brightly coloured clothes, strutting down the courthouse like a peacock." During the drive to the courthouse, which was rather harrowing, no one uttered a word, for there was nothing to say. Bobby could see his brother Chris was apprehensive this morning, as you would naturally expect. Indeed, the family was all feeling rather flustered, and dreading the next 4 laborious days that lay ahead of them, like a lingering bad smell that would not abate no matter what you did to eliminate it. Chris looked rather debonair this morning, more handsome than ever. He was wearing a smart navy blue pinstripe suit that looked as if it had been made to measure by an exclusive tailor's, and a pale blue cotton shirt, complemented by a rather swanky navy and white tie, as well as a pair of black Oxford shoes that were so shiny you could see your reflection on the leather. Chris persuaded Natalia to stay behind at the house. She seemed heartily relieved not to be coming to the inquest, and who could blame her? "I don't want the inquest to upset you," he told her lovingly, "because it might affect our baby." "Good luck," she had whispered to Chris, throwing her arms around him and giving him a tender kiss on the cheek. "Everything is going to be all right, I promise you. Don't you worry about anything. This time next week it'll all be over, and we can put this horrible business behind us once and for all. We have so much to look forward to in the future. Remember that." As the Hilton family neared the courthouse, Bobby could feel the tug of his heart, as it began to flutter violently in his chest. His hands were wet and clammy. He bit his lips nervously, surprised to see he'd actually drawn blood. His father fastidiously looked for a parking spot outside the courthouse. A female radio presenter, in her dulcet tones, began to discuss the inquest. "New theories emerge at the inquest today regarding the disappearance of Judy Bengali, who vanished after a fight with her boyfriend Chris Hilton 12 long years ago, when she walked home alone on a lonely, sequestered country road in the small, unassuming seaside town, never to be seen or heard again. So what did happen to Judy Bengali?" She began to list the key witnesses, the evidence to be reconsidered, the roll call of witnesses. "Right, I've had enough of that," said Mr. Hilton, thumping the steering wheel in agitation and hurriedly switching off the radio. He parked the minivan, and with a vacillating hesitancy, the van door rolled open, and the Hilton family steadily climbed out, greeted to the cool flush of the May air. The Hilton family marched towards the entrance of the courthouse that was busily flanked by the crush of photographers that were deliberately blocking their path. Bobby drew in a deep breath, straightening his back stiffly and grimacing inwardly, wishing with all his heart that this hungry school of piranhas, with their flashing cameras directed towards Chris, would go away. He walked past the sea of treacherous cameramen, reporters and journalists, his eyes fixed on a point beyond him. "Chris!" cried out one of the reporters. "How are you feeling about the inquest today? Are you nervous about giving your statement in court?"
"Did you kill Judy Bengali?" came another confrontational voice. "What happened 12 years ago? Have you got anything to hide?" Chris's face remained stoic and expressionless, giving nothing away, as he stared at the middle distance. Soon they entered the court foyer, and were wrapped in the civility of the law. Everything became significantly calmer, and after their bags were checked by security, they finally entered the court. The Hilton family are met cordially by their lawyer, Norris Boxwell. He greets them warmly and ushers them down a long sweeping corridor until they enter the courtroom, where the Hilton family are rudely confronted by the very people they dread seeing, all inauspiciously gathered together in the same place. Bobby's eyes travel over the Bengali family, only a few yards away, clustered around some officials. Bobby is visibly shocked by how thin and drawn Mrs. Bengali looks. Her eyes are like sunken hollows, but they're also puffy and swollen, as if she's been crying for years. Her frail body looks as fragile as a porcelain doll, as if she might just easily break. Her once red hair has turned as white as snow, long before its due time. Judy's two younger sisters stand protectively on either side of their parents. They're both now in their 20s, with similar strawberry blonde hair that Judy had, and blue eyes. One of the sisters looks almost like a double-ganger for Judy. For a moment Bobby forces in a deep breath, as their likeness to Judy is uncanny. It sends shivers of dread down his spine. He doesn't need to be reminded of her. He has had more than enough reminders of Judy to last an entire lifetime. He doesn't need more. Mr. Bengali's face is tight, his calculating eyes hard and cold, but his expression remains carefully guarded. He's holding his wife's hand tightly, giving it an encouraging squeeze from time to time, as if to say, "We'll get through this." The court doors open, and a middle-aged woman, the state coroner, bows her head briefly before the court. A tall, wiry man with a receding hairline and a thick pair of glasses addresses the coroner, with his back facing away from the family. "Your Honour, we're here today. The hope is to determine whether Judy Elizabeth Bengali is now deceased, and if this is the case, the possible circumstances of her death. During these proceedings, we will be considering the following, which may or may not explain her absence. Judy might have willingly chosen to disappear, have chosen to live elsewhere. She might have chosen to leave and be hidden by others. She might have set off on an adventure and died a natural death, such as a stroke or a pulmonary embolism, a heart attack, and her body was subsequently never recovered. She could have had an accidental death from a fall. Judy may have intentionally ended her life, or her fortuitous untimely death may have been caused by another and been concealed like a motor accident. Finally, we need to consider whether Judy died from the hands of another." So there we are. That's the end of part 2 of our story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.